Good morning.
Yeah, there we go.
Why am I wearing this? It's because we're taping, and presumably I may mutter, I may turn around, it may not be totally clear, but I promise you, you will hear everything I have to say, which is a good thing, because this is not what you would take as a formal presentation or lecture. It's going to be a little more free form than that. So first of all, I'm Bill Janeway. I live a dual life between, well, put it this way, in 1971, I got a doctorate in economics at the University of Cambridge, being taught by Keynes's students, particularly Richard Kahn. I then decided that what was becoming mainstream economics, the neoclassical synthesis of Paul Samuelson and Bob Solow, was not what I wanted to teach, so I took a 35-year sabbatical, which led me into venture capital. In 2006, I retired as vice chairman of Warburg Pincus, venture capital private equity firm, returned to the University of Cambridge in time for the global financial crisis and the consequent Great Recession to make economics an interesting subject again. So I'm now immersed, embedded in the economics faculty at Cambridge. As I'm sure you're well aware, I'm a co-founder following George Soros of INET. I published a book in 2012. It remains available in hardcover at an Amazon site near you. It's called Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy. I am actually, and this is, if you like, contrary to my mercantile instincts, I'm in the process of completing a second edition to be published, I assume, in 2018, early 2018, which will, if you like, bring things down to date. So today, I'm going to give you, if you like, a flavor of the second edition of my book, but I'm going to begin, because I was asked to, with particular reference to the phenomenon of distributed ledger technologies and cryptocurrencies. But going to get there has to begin with my introduction. And the introduction concerns the inversion of the relationship between digital technologies, semiconductors to software, and the state. Much of my book is concerned with the extent to which innovation at the frontier, and in my own lifetime, that means the invention and the development and the deployment of all the technologies that came together to enable the digital revolution, required support from sources of finance not concerned with immediate economic return. Historically, all the way back to the canals and railroads, through electrification, one of those sources has been a mission-driven state. In the 19th century, largely driven by national development, particularly in the United States, also by national security, particularly in Germany. More recently, of course, from World War II, it was the national security mission of the United States government, with particular instrumentality being the Department of Defense, that funded the exploration and ultimately the deployment of everything from the first computing systems, from the adoption and maturation of silicon technologies, the development of software as separate from hardware, and the internet as the medium of communication and ultimately transaction. All of that, as you well know, came out of defense-related, politically legitimate state interventions in the market economy. Now, I'm also going to talk about the other source in due course, the other source of finance, bubbles, which you, I think, heard quite a lot about yesterday. And I'm going to give you a typology of bubbles, which I think, particularly post-2008, is particularly useful. But when I say that the digital revolution was launched and supported to maturity by government interventions, today, and probably dating back to somewhere between 1990, 95, and the global financial crisis, we've experienced an inversion. Today, the digital revolution is on its own. It's taken off. Not only is it no longer dependent on state support, on the contrary, across an enormous range of what have been legitimate exercises of state authority and responsibility, the digital revolution is challenging them. Those of you who got here by Uber have experienced one aspect of that. I'm going to talk about that in due course, a little later this morning, about what it means when these services that have the enormous distinctive attribute of effectively zero technological friction encounter political frictions of multiple sorts as they move from the digital domain into the domain of atoms. If they go from bits to atoms, the frictions emerge somewhat to the shock, surprise, and horror of the genius, innovating entrepreneurs who have invented these services and assume that they will take over the world without friction. But let's start with cryptocurrencies as one very interesting expression of the technological capabilities that are digitally enabled and the perverse, contradictory, hubristic tendencies of the entrepreneurs who mobilize them. I choose my terms carefully. So, cryptocurrencies on blockchain infrastructure. Now, the first thing that's really interesting about what's been happening is that this phenomenon has moved in two radically different directions. The utilization of the cryptocurrencies riding on top of distributed ledger technology has been retail, opaque, and unregulated until very recently. But the adoption of the infrastructure is at wholesale, transparent, and regulated. In other words, one way to think about Bitcoin itself is that an existence proof, a public demonstration of the availability of a distributed ledger infrastructure that could keep track and provide for non-repudiation of transactions. Now, the fact is, I'm told, I'm not an expert on this, the US Navy has been running a distributed ledger system for a generation, with every ship in the Navy knowing where every other ship is, continuously updated. And this technology is not quite as uniquely innovative as represented. But the use of this sort of technology that is actually beginning to get some traction. I gave you, they circulated this little note on how Maersk is pioneering the use of blockchain technology for marine insurance. The major banks are all exploring whether or not this might provide a lower cost system for interbank connections. The Bank of England, most particularly of the central banks, has been in advance in exploring the relevance of this technology to the infrastructure of banking. These are applications that are taking place between known entities, large, established, well-known, transparently available identities, under a regulated and transparent environment. This is the opposite of what Bitcoin was supposed to be, right? So, in the meantime, Bitcoin has migrated, courtesy of Ethereum and others, into the world of ICOs. Now, I have to tell you that I think of ICOs as scam squared. Why? Because you take cash, you buy, I'm saying Bitcoin, but it's Ethereum or whatever, in order to buy a token. The token is for the purchase of something, a service typically, the availability and the utility and the value of which is to be determined from the start. In the meantime, you're taking the cash, buying the Bitcoin, transferring it to an entrepreneur who is going to, or not, provide a service that you will find valuable. In the meantime, what he's doing is speculating on the value of Bitcoin, right? Speculative, madness of crowds, right? South Sea bubble. Apocryphally, there was a project that was funded in the South Sea bubble circa 1720 that was identified in the prospectus. This is apocryphal, but it should have been true. A project, the purpose of which is to be disclosed at a later date. And supposedly the offering was oversubscribed. That's what we're seeing right now here. And the phenomenon will serve to accelerate the regulation up here of these currencies. So the Securities Exchange Commission announced last month that a German outfit called DAO, not DOA, that would be dead on arrival. DAO, in making these offerings, was actually issuing securities and was required to comply with the Securities Act. It said, we will look at these on a case-by-case basis, but be warned, A, this phenomenon lends itself to fraud, and B, we are going to be inspecting these offerings and they may well become subject to the Securities Act regulations. The Chinese, of course, have gone one step further in demonstrating the regulatory role of the state in effectively banning ICOs and providing what is today currently only heavy-handed rumor generation that Bitcoin exchanges are going to be closed. Whether Bitcoin mining, in which China dominates, will also be immediately regulatorily affected isn't clear. But in any case, the wild, wild east of cryptocurrencies is clearly under scrutiny and will come, is very likely to come, under greater regulatory supervision. And it's about time. Because, let's talk about currencies in general. Now, we all know it's a truism that there are three attributes of a currency, right? Unit of account, which in principle, on its own can exist. So, for example, you all know what a guinea is in Britain? A guinea, under the old British system, was a unit of account exclusively. It had evolved into a unit of account exclusively. It goes back to the 16th century, when gold from West Africa, from Guinea, was minted and traded against sterling silver pounds. And it turned out that the sort of market exchange rate was 105 to 1, i.e. 21 shillings. A guinea was worth 21 silver shillings. Well, as recently as when I was a graduate student, which is only 50 years ago, if you walked down Bond Street in Mayfair and looked into the windows of the fancy shops, you would see ladies' gowns priced in guineas. You had to pay for them in pounds. The guinea was exclusively a unit of account. It was a nice kind of existence proof in any first-year monetary economics course or money and banking course that a unit of account could persist independently of its other traditional roles. The second, of course, being store of value, and the third, means of exchange. Now, let's talk about cryptocurrencies in that environment. The first point is that the unit of account actually remains dollars, remains fiat, as people refer to it, government-sponsored currencies. And as a store of value, these currencies are really vehicles of speculation, which means in turn that their use as means of exchange is actually limited and appears to be declining in the United States. There was this kind of phenomenon where Overstock.com said, pay us in Bitcoin, but with the volatility in the dollar exchange of Bitcoin, its utility as a means of exchange as well as a store of value, because who wants to be caught with it? You may speculate, I'll be caught with it and it'll go up, but it's also gone down very sharply in the last few days. So that's the kind of conventional critique of crypto. But there's another one which is not quite as recognized, but in some ways underpins everything else. And that is lender of last resort. Every currency, historically, that becomes widely used and trusted is widely used and trusted because there is a credible lender of last resort that stands behind it. The Bank of England emerged as that in the crisis of 1825. Lombard Street has a marvelous, the original Lombard Street, not Perry Merling's sequel, has a marvelous, dramatic soap opera of how the Bank of England put its private for-profit role ahead of its emergent public good role until the Duke of Wellington's government pounded on it because the provincial banks, I don't think you've ever heard of this sort of thing happening, the provincial banks in Britain, in pursuit of rates of return that were not available because of the post-Napoleonic War slump and the imposition of a formal gold standard in Britain, went in pursuit of greater rates of return by particularly buying the debt of the new countries that emerged in Latin America from the collapse of the Spanish Empire. They had no idea about the underlying economics, about the financial or the political context in which this debt was issued. But instead of the safe working capital loan that was only going to yield 3-4% by lending to merchants and traders whom they knew locally, they took the money and bought Venezuelan bonds, which of course defaulted. When they went to their London correspondents to pull their deposits, this became a genuine, arguably the first genuine, honest-to-God banking crisis. Mary, I think that's right. And at the end of the day, the Bank of England mobilized and provided liquidity to the London banks by every means possible. Again and again, Overend and Gurney, 1868, first Barings crisis, 1890, the onset of World War I, of the Great War, August 1914, 1931 in particular, the global financial crisis of the interwar years, and on, central banks, right through 2008, have been forced to declare themselves as lenders of last resort to their financial system. And two things come out of that that are worth thinking about. First, historically, credit comes before currency. In the history of finance, going back to the medieval trade fairs, book credit between merchants to be settled at a later date is how trade, commerce, economic transactions were financed. With currency, only as the net settlement mechanism if and when credit balances needed to be reconciled. And therefore, it is credit, trust, which is the underlying sea on which currencies float. And of course, the immediate question is, tell me again who's the lender of last resort to the issuer of Ethereum tokens, right? And there is none. So these exercises in innovative opportunism and speculative invitations to fraud will, I think, historically go down as demonstrating that there is an underlying technology. It happens, of course, that the Bitcoin blockchain is crap. It's extremely limited in performance. It represents, it functions at, and this is even after the hard fork, it functions at, 0.1% of the throughput of what goes through the Fed switch, what goes through the SWIFT network every minute of the day. It is an absolutely long, long way from being mature enough for use by big people. And there's no proof as of yet that there are large use cases where it actually is essential, particularly given that the use cases where it's getting traction are where the parties know each other and trust each other. That's the point. They're actually not trying to take advantage of what was supposed to be the distinctive attributes of crypto, that it was opaque and unregulated. So I don't think we have to spend an enormous amount of time. And the good news, by the way, is that when this, quote, bubble, unquote, bursts, the systemic consequences are going to be unnoticeable. And that gets us to thinking about bubbles. Now, wow, we have a magnetic. You got all that? Okay, it's gone. So let's talk about bubbles. And since I know you had some discussion yesterday, I'm not going to try to, go through a historical account or a theoretical discussion, although we can do that under questioning, as to why do bubbles exist? Why do they emerge? There's wonderful literature. Okay, I didn't give you this to read. Jose Schenkman's Arrow Lectures from 2010. Hyun Shin, Jose Schenkman's at Columbia. Hyun Shin's Clarendon Lectures from Oxford. That book is called Risk and Liquidity. It is, by and large, the best accessible, the math is not extreme, analysis of the dynamics of the great credit bubble and the global financial crisis. Scheikman's book is about equity markets, about equity bubbles, and about how bubbles emerge in the stock market, where prices, under the modern finance theory, which has now, I'm delighted to say, been rendered anachronistically historic, where prices of shares are supposed to equal the net present value of the expected future cash flows. What I will just say, if you like, as a observation, what Scheikman and Shin, who were, by the way, colleagues and very good friends at Princeton before Hyun went to Basel as chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements, and Jose moved up to Manhattan and no longer has to deal with New Jersey Transit. a subject entirely worthy of a lecture on its own. What they agreed about was the signature of a bubble. Quote, the demand curve inverts. What does that mean? It means that when the price goes up, volume increases. Instead of price rationing demand, the increase in price is a signal that accelerates demand. Now, Shin does a very lovely job of showing this almost mechanically in the banking system. Summarizing it very briefly, a bank manages itself in terms of a target leverage ratio. 2007, let's say it was 30 to 40 to 1. Today it's 10 to 15 to 1. We can come back to that. That in and of itself is all you have to know about how much more resilient the banking system is today than it was 10 years ago. What that means is that if the value of the assets go up, the bank has unused leverage at whatever the ratio is. In 2007, as the value of assets rose, and that means the tradable assets, which used to be held to maturity like mortgages, and became tradable securities and therefore subject to the same dynamics as in the equity markets. As those prices rose, the bank had the capacity with the same fixed amount of equity to own more assets. So banks, when they ran out of borrowers in the real economy, could buy each other's assets to get their leverage ratios back to where they wanted them. The leverage ratio had fallen from 35 to 25 to 1. So they bought more assets, bid the price of those assets up further, and set off the spiral, which ultimately collapsed when the ultimate underlying securities, those mortgages, saw their default rates rise and trading in them get frozen, and consequently there was a massive mark to reality and a complete freeze in the banking system. So looking forward, in observing the behavior of any tradable asset, the signal that it's moving into bubble territory is that when the price goes up, demand for it increases, trading volume increases. The entire rational bubble literature, going back to the great Jean Tirole 25 years ago, assumes that when price rises, demand declines and trading volume declines. And that's why Sheinkman's disagreement theory of how bubbles emerge, if you pardon the expression, trumps the rational bubble literature because it happens to correspond with observable historical reality. Okay, so bubbles and their relationship with the real economy. Here is my highly simplistic, two-dimensional typology of bubbles. Along one dimension, we have the potential, but let's say productivity of the asset which is subject to the bubble, increasing. Down here we have, for example, beach houses. Up here we have, for example, internet. Bubbles can affect any asset that is traded in a public liquid market, from tulip bulbs to the shares of companies that are changing the world, like the shares of the infrastructure software companies of the late 1990s, including, I'm extraordinarily pleased to say, two of the companies that I was deeply involved in creating and funding. But the second factor, the second dimension, is where is the bubble taking place? is it taking place in the banking system? Or in, I'll say, equity markets, but by equity markets, I would include the junk bond market. And what's the difference between these two? Leverage. In the equity markets, certainly in the United States and generally in Europe, the ability to borrow legally against shares is highly limited. In the US, the Federal Reserve margin requirements have been set at 50% for 30 years. It used to be a policy variable. It's been fixed for at least 30, probably more like 40 years. What that means is the maximum leverage is 1-to-1. Yes, you can do back leverage. Yes, you can do unofficial leverage. Yes, in China, there have been all sorts of improvised techniques for creating more leverage in the equity markets, but it doesn't remotely approach what is, a conservative leverage ratio in the banking system is 10-to-1. And obviously, what we reached in 2007, when a decline in the value of assets of barely 2% rendered Bear Stearns insolvent, is radically greater. So, this is 2008. This is 1999. That's the productive bubble. A bubble in the equity markets, including the junk bond market, which largely funded the build-out. It was the junk bonds, $1 trillion worth of junk bonds that funded the laying of fiber, not all of which was used at the time, but all of which and more has been used since, as well as the exploration of what to do with this new technology. Yes, pets.com and boo.com, but also eBay and Amazon. It took $2.5 billion of risk capital, equity, hybrid convertibles, and junk bonds for Amazon to reach positive cash flow. Only in a bubble could that have happened. The 2008 banking system funding beach houses in the Nevada desert, unproductive, and the consequences of when the bubble burst, and all bubbles burst, the consequences, orders of magnitude more devastating economically than when the dot-com bubble burst in 2000. A couple of further thoughts about that. What about unicorns? So we've got this new phenomenon, and it is new. This is genuinely new. A bubble in the valuation of illiquid securities, assets which are not freely tradable. Two different questions. One, what is the promise? And two, what is the motivation? Promise is, I suppose, represented by, FOMA of the fangs, fear of missing out on the next Facebook, Google, or Alphabet. And the motivation being that same kind of search for yield that motivated provincial banks in Britain, in England, in 1825 to buy Venezuelan debt. My father used to call investors who were prepared to suspend any exercise of judgment in pursuit of yield as rate whores, whoring after whatever offered the possibility of a greater rate of return than a conventionally safe asset would deliver. The unicorn bubble is subject to two different tests. The first is already happening. It's what you might call the mark to reality. What happens when one or other of these companies goes public, and like Snap, is traded in a liquid market, and the investors discover that it's worth less than the negotiated private placement price was. The second probably is going to happen this winter. It's when the central banks, meaning specifically the Fed and the ECB, start reducing their balance sheets. We have been living through an environment that in peacetime, I think it's fair to say we've never experienced in peacetime in the history of capitalism that arguably begins somewhere in the 18th century and advances, where for what's now a decade, real interest rates have been negative. The real safe interest rate has been negative or barely positive. I mean, in Germany, 10-year bonds, what is it, minus 0.9% currently? Something like that. In the US, with roughly 1.5%, 2% inflation, 10-year investment grade bonds, treasuries have been around 2%. So just about zero real interest rate. That does extraordinary things to investment managers, including the ones who are supposed to be the most conservative, pension fund managers, who have obligations that go out to the end of time, and which obligations increase in value as interest rates decline, right? Because they're discounted back at something related to the policy interest rate. So you have this perverse phenomenon of low interest rates increasing the liabilities, therefore driving the motivation to do whatever it takes to find assets that offer the possibility of a rate of return that will at least partially meet the increased value of the long-term liabilities of the institution. Well, when the unicorn bubble burst, and it will probably deflate rather than burst because it's not in the public market, it'll probably be more like one after another rather than all at once. What'll happen? Well, a certain number of entrepreneurs are going to learn the hard way that what my psychotic mentor taught me 40 years ago, which is that corporate happiness is positive cash flow, that paying your bills because your customers are giving you more cash than you are spending to deliver a service, an offering to them, that's positive cash flow from operations, versus paying your bills by issuing securities, which is what across the board, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera, have been doing, that at a certain point, you meet the Minsky survival constraint. You all know what the Minsky survival constraint is, right? Pay your bills by selling a good or service, pay your bills by selling an asset, pay your bills by issuing a new liability, or don't pay your bills and go out of business. So there are going to be some real challenges in the boardrooms of the unicorn companies, some of which probably have some sort of path to liquidity. It's possible that a grown-up management, and I'm not denying the possibility that such could be put in place at Uber, could do a really hard-nosed evaluation, market by market by market, and cut back to force positive cash flow from San Francisco or New York, I gather not from Tallinn, even though, because they're subject to some real challenges as an operating business model. One is the need to subsidize one or other or both sides of a two-sided market under competitive challenge from others, because there's no deep secret sauce underlying the Uber app. Lyft's app is just as successful. I was just using it in San Francisco last week. But second, the network externalities are very limited. The network externalities only exist on the demand side of the market. And that network externality, that if I have Uber on my phone, I'm more likely to use Uber in London when I'm in London because I use it in New York. But it takes 11 seconds to have the Lyft app. And where Lyft is also there, I may decide that, these Uber guys, to use a technical term that us venture guys tend to use, these Uber guys are real assholes. And why do I want to contribute to them when Lyft are the socially acceptable ride-hailing service? Now, of course, they're both also subject, and this is where we get to the next issue about the digital revolution. Remember, I began by saying the inversion between the state and the digital economy? The promise of the digital revolution in economic terms, and therefore in investment terms, is that friction disappears. Okay, you got all this? This is now going to come down, and we're going to talk about friction. So atoms to bits to atoms. Friction is associated with atoms, obviously, right? That moving a piece of wood across a surface generates friction. To the extent that I can abstract from that and render a virtual simulation, I can arbitrarily set the friction generated to 0. And in a sense, that's what, as a service experience at the micro level, Google does. We don't have to get on a bus, go to the public library, go to the card catalog, get an encyclopedia, or find the relevant resource. We just tap in, we just talk to the phone, and Google gives us the answer. 0 friction, right? But digital services come in 2 sorts. Is the service purely in the digital domain, or is the service in the physical domain? And of course, Uber, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, these are all services that are delivered in the physical domain. They involve human beings actually in the loop. What's the status of those human beings? Independent contractors? Employees? Something in between? This is a contested subject. It's a deeply contested subject. And by the way, it's contested, and this is really challenging, market by market, sub-market by sub-market. Not even necessarily a national issue. With Airbnb, nobody's proposing to regulate Airbnb at the national level. It's city by city by city. Oh, and by the way, there's a reason why. I mean, look, people have been renting out rooms for money for a very long time. I'll bet you could find them in Damascus, Baghdad, not just Rome, but 2,000 years before, probably in Luxor, Egypt, 5,000 years ago. There's a reason why an ecosystem, a regulatory ecosystem has grown up around that. You know, why, for example, if you're going to rent out a room for money, you really have to have a fire extinguisher, maybe a fire door, maybe even a fire escape. The reasons for that. It's not rent-seeking activity on the part of hotel owners. It's because people have died because of neglect. So there are multiple regulatory frictions that any provider of a service that moves back from the digital domain to the physical domain is likely to have to address. And moreover, have to address again and again and again. I was in Barcelona when Uber opened up in Barcelona. The friction they had to address were the Catalanian taxi drivers using their tire irons to destroy the cars of the Uber drivers. This was direct action in the streets. But of course, there's also another source of friction, which is today in the process. Boy, I'm glad I'm taking a little time to complete the preparation of the second edition of my book, because the emergence of antitrust addressing even the digital service providers that stay in the digital domain, specifically Google, is a very, very interesting phenomenon. Now, under the current political situation in the US, this is extremely unlikely to occur at the national level in the US. But the US is a really weird country because the US has 51 governments. Only one of those governments is a Lockean government, a government whose constitution has very limited enumerated powers. The 50 other governments, the states, inherit from the British Crown the police power, the Hobbesian police power of regulation for the public good. And there are at least 10 to 15 attorneys general of the states that have demonstrated a willingness to pioneer interventions in the market economy in pursuit of the public good. So even if Google, et cetera, are exempted operationally from antitrust assault at the national level, we may expect to see all sorts of regulatory initiatives from the state level. And by the way, as a footnote, the pardon power of the President of the United States appears to be constitutionally unlimited, but it only applies to violation of federal law, not to state law, as Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General of the state of New York, has just been stating very publicly. By the way, add to your reading list to the extent that you want to understand something much deeper than is usually available about the political economy of the United States. Gary Gerstle, Gerstle, he's the Pitt Professor of the Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge. His book is called Liberty and Coercion, and it's about the coexistence of these two radically different philosophies of government institutionalized at the state level, Hobbesian, and at the federal level, Lockean. It's a great work. It's one of the most imaginative work that's addressed a subject that has been almost entirely neglected historically. Okay. Now, we talked about crypto, we talked about currencies, we talked about ICOs, we talked about bubbles. Did they actually show this wonderful Norwegian television film?
We do it every year.
You do it every year, really?
Yeah.
That's great.
It's part of the Eric Ragnar's class.
Oh, very good, very good. It was a lot of fun. It was only, sadly, it didn't get picked up by American public television. So I gather it had an extraordinary audience in Norway. And it's nice to know that it crossed the Baltic Sea. Let me semi-conclude, and this is all, now we're going to, we'll shift into discussion, questions, open-ended, after maybe we take a break in 5-10 minutes. New economic thinking, related to what I've been talking about. So, one of the discussions that I myself have been pushing inside INET is that while it's not yet time to declare victory, we really should realize that the world has shifted. Okay, INET's funded a variety of initiatives at the individual scholar level, at the institutional level, YSI is one of them that cuts across institutions. And when we began, there was this kind of still excessively relevant, particularly at the level of the undergraduate curriculum, this caricature of economics as being all about rational optimizing agents endowed with knowledge not available to human beings, operating in modes which endogenously generated self-perpetuating equilibrium across time. It happens that even in 2007, you think about it, there was a kind of diversity, heterogeneity in micro. Behavioral economics, of course, the invasion from psychology, the brilliant insight of Kahneman and Tversky as to how to make what they thought they'd learned from their lab experiments. And I'm not sure how much you can generalize from doing anything with sophomores in college, but nonetheless, they succeeded, of penetrating economics by translating their lab findings into a form that could be communicated mathematically, prospect theory. It's a brilliant demonstration that despite what appeared to be the unbreakable membrane, subject only to imperialist extension in the spirit of Gary Becker, of the rational choice paradigm, economics was accessible to ideas from other social science. Another example at the semi-micro to meso level was the proliferation of network theory that I'm delighted to say was pioneered by the current chair of the economics faculty at Cambridge, Sanjeev Goyal, who wrote the book on network theory, which was available in 2008, a kind of toolkit. You had both behavioral and networks to help understand what the hell is going on here. Is this optimizing behavior, right? When the banks freeze, when nobody can get any money, when unemployment goes from 3% to 13%, more or less overnight. So there was this kind of resource, this reservoir. And unfortunately, up here at macro equals DSGE. Now, there's been lots written about macro DSGE. I actually just read, and I highly recommend, Joe Stiglitz has been a busy boy this summer. And he just has, in the NBER 10 days ago, 3 papers. 3 papers. One is a really nice, succinct, very accessible, all-out assault on DSGE. Another is a paper which goes back here on the economics of information. I should have added that's another was part of the reservoir, asymmetric information, Akerlof, Mike Spence, I'm delighted to say, along with Joe, supporters and allies and mentors for INET, and therefore for all of you. And then the third is on structural transformation and how we should think about the movement. This is deeply relevant to me. Again, I'm so pleased that I'm taking a little longer on the second edition because I can include references to Joe's new papers. What my law about, Joe Stiglitz and I arrived at Cambridge on just about exactly the same day in 1965, beg your pardon, in 1965. And the problem with Joe Stiglitz is when you think you've had a really good idea, you find out that he had it 20 years before you. But Joe's third paper is to think about the digital revolution as comparable, analogically, with the shift from agriculture to manufacturing, with the same level, the same degree of pervasive obsolescence of occupations, of modes of economic activity, and the need to invent, support, sponsor new modes of economic activity, which include Marxian relationship between means of production, and now he doesn't get into a Marxist, any kind of Marxian dialogue about it, but at that deep level of structural transformation, which transcends the cyclical movements within an economic regime. So those three papers are all really, really worth reading, and they're all on the NBER website, and they're all dated August or September, I think September 2017. So they're very easy to find. Now, here, what we've been seeing is the addition of financial frictions to DSGE models. Now, New Keynesian was different from New Classical because there were frictions in price and wages, that they were not instantaneously adjusted, and therefore New Keynesian DSGE models could allow for unemployment, other than, as Paul Krugman famously put it, due to Brad DeLong put it, that in the DSGE model, unemployment could only be the result, either persistent unemployment, of a great rusting, the physical capital all of a sudden was no longer productive, or a great forgetting, we forgot how to use it, or a great vacation. The workers all decided to go to the beach. So the New Keynesian models were observationally superior, but they involved the same kind of rational rep agent optimizing her intertemporal utility, canceling out any financial system because she's both her own creditor and debtor. So you net it out, there's no financial system. The only financial input is the policy interest rate, which is exogenous. And that was true even of the New Keynesian models. So what's been going on has been to try to add some financial frictions that you might imagine intermediaries are collateral constrained, or the borrowers are. That if only that representative agent could borrow against her future earnings, she could continue to optimize no matter what. Well, look, I used one technical term that venture capitalists use with each other. I'll use a second one. It's bullshit. The borrowers are not the same as the creditors. And frankly, and despite the transient phenomenon, well, let's say, of social finance, of peer-to-peer lending, borrowers and lenders are intermediated. And one of the most exciting things going on, 2 more reading assignments. B and S, C and R. Brunnermeier and Sanikoff, The I Theory of Money. Sanikoff, on his way from Princeton to Stanford, stopped off to get the Clark Medal for this work last year. It puts financial intermediaries at the center, hinge of the relationship between the financial system and the real economy. And how what they call the paradox of prudence explicitly, you believe this? American Economic Review explicitly cites the paradox of thrift as the demonstration of how individual market participants rationally pursuing their own self-interest as best they can in a world of fundamental uncertainty can produce a mess which is technically known as a coordination failure, right? Coimbra and Ray, that's Helene Ray of the LSE, heterogeneous intermediaries. So they take it a step further. They explicitly cite Brunnermeier and Sanikoff. That's really good. That says a school is developing, building on itself, on how, whereas Brunnermeier and Sannikov have, in effect, a representative intermediary because it makes the math easier. Coimbra and Ray take it a step further and talk about the interaction of heterogeneous intermediaries distinguished by different qualities of balance sheet, different sources of funding, all sorts of ways in which they could react differently and in a much richer way. Now, this kind of work, the math gets really pretty complicated, pretty challenging. If you're trying to generate the kind of gold standard analytical model with a closed form solution. And my expectation, and this goes, this kind of is further beyond, I think that the really interesting news about economics as economics and finance come back together. This is the first thing. Finance and economics are coming back together. They were already coming back together at the micro level. Behavioral finance is what the guys at Princeton that Shankman assembled, including Brunnermeier, including Shin, they were already talking about this 10 years before the global financial crisis. I'll never forget a presentation that Harrison Hong, now also at Columbia, he gave to a group of alumni, which included many people from Wall Street. And he first put up the kind of, toy models largely out of Chicago and MIT of modern finance theory and efficient markets, and said, well, our mission here is to develop ways of understanding inefficient financial markets. And that was 10, 12 years ago. So the reintegration of finance and economics, in a way, is the biggest story going on here. Previously, the notion of efficient financial markets and rational expectations economics said, well, we can take you for granted. We can each take you for granted. In each case, assets are going to equal their fundamental value, the net present value of the future cash flows. In each case, markets are going to clear efficiently with resources appropriately allocated to their highest and best use. We don't have to deal with each other because we're all going to work just the way we're supposed to work in an ideal world. The mess, the gift that keeps on giving, the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, has forced them, both sides, into a recognition of the heterogeneous richness of worlds in which people disagree about a future which no one can know definitively, and where all economic activity assumes financing activity. All financing activity is related sooner or later to what's going on in the real economy. Who needs money, what the cash flows are or are likely to be, or what we might hope they would be, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really good news. Methodologically, it's very challenging. Every time we enrich the content, we're making it harder and harder to provide complete analytical explanations. That's why, and it may be a hope driven by experience from 40 years ago, that we'll begin to see greater diversity methodologically in economics and finance. And most specifically, every natural science has evolved towards greater use of simulation techniques. Began with physics. In the early 1970s, physicists began building special purpose, algorithm-specific processors. They were called icing machines. And they were necessary in order, given the limited computer power of general purpose, first generation general purpose microprocessors, they were needed in order to run the numbers on quantum mechanical models. Chemists began using simulation methods in the 1980s. One of my wife's and I best friends is a great organic chemist named Barry Sharpless, got the Nobel for something called asymmetric oxidation about 20 years ago. And Barry used to be scathing about his peers who were doing what he called dry lab. Wet lab is getting your hands wet doing, Bunsen burners and test tubes, and that's, it was real chemistry. Dry lab was doing a simulation. Barry started doing simulations about 15 years ago. Everybody in chemistry does simulations as an order both to guide what might be an experiment in the real world, to define its scope, and develop what it might mean depending on how it works. And this goes down to, doing these unbelievable femtolaser analysis of chemical reactions. Biologists, more recently, with the rise of systems biology, my wife reinvented herself as a geneticist when we were at Cambridge, and I'm a trailing spouse in this world. The only thing I know for sure is if you sit down with somebody who is really deeply involved in genetics, genomics, life science, biology, and they walk you through how we've moved from what was 40 years ago, the central dogma, DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein, that's been completely overturned. There's no such thing as a central dogma. As soon as you get your head around what they're telling you about how, for example, epigenetics works, or all that junk DNA that isn't junk DNA, how could it be junk DNA when it carries a systemic cost, a systemic burden under natural selection? It would be eliminated if it weren't doing something. It is doing something. We just don't know what it is. You get your head around this and they say, it's not that simple. So systems biology is a computer. It's a computer practice. It's modeling pathways, incredibly complex pathways that, as you get all the way up to the cellular level, become completely intractable with any attempt to definitively structurally model them. You can only simulate the behavior and try to observe what is possible to happen. Well, I think we're going to see more and more of this in the social sciences. And by the way, two things go on here. One is, it's very challenging for established economists who have mastered the tools of building closed-form analytical models, and who will be always deeply concerned about what happens when you go to simulation and the threat is, and it's seen as a threat, not an opportunity, that anything goes. You tweak. Von Neumann used to say, give me 3 parameters and I'll give you an elephant, give me 4 and I'll make him move his nose up and down. That as you go to simulation, it becomes easy to tweak the initial conditions to produce whatever outcome you want. Well, there's some evidence from the work of people like Giovanni Dossi that you can discipline simulation models. Obviously, our friends and colleagues at Oxford at INET, or INET at Oxford, have been doing a lot of work around the housing industry in collaboration with the Bank of England. The bank finds it useful, productive, to try to simulate the behavior of the housing market in Britain. I think we're going to see an extension and a growing legitimization of simulation techniques, which are not necessarily what we think of as agent-based models. There's a whole family, a whole spectrum of simulating relationships, simulating systemic behavior. I think we're going to see more and more of that. The last thing, and then I'm going to shut up and get some water. The last thing is that, yes, so you're right. Economists have an extraordinary opportunity for maybe 400 years, going back to Sir William Petty and political arithmetic. Economists have thought of themselves as uniquely the data-rich social scientists, practicing the data-rich social science. Well, guess what? One of the consequences of the digital revolution is that all the social sciences are data-rich. They're all being immersed, drowning in data. Obviously, a great deal of it, which makes it harder, is unstructured data. It's social media. Some of it comes in the form of blobs, like pictures. So economists simultaneously have a challenge of, indeed, learning from computer science, techniques of data science, of data analysis, which goes beyond what's taught as quantitative economics, but in turn have the opportunity to extend out and help teach other social scientists what it means to be dealing with lots and lots and lots of data. In doing this, they need to pay a lot of attention, and here's my last reading for you. Angus Deaton, another great Princeton economist who stayed at Princeton, unlike Shankman and Shin. Angus Deaton got the Nobel, 2 years ago, published a paper. I'm trying to remember his co-author. It's not his wife, Ann Case. That's the papers about increasing mortality. This is a paper on randomized controlled trials. And you can find it easily enough on his website. And it is pretty much a diatribe about how economists have adopted, the kind of slogan and brand of RCTs as a mark of scientific discipline without absorbing, understanding, and operationally executing what is necessary for a trial to be genuinely randomized and controlled. And that in the medical world, in the clinical world, it's been a long struggle to establish what is genuinely a randomized controlled trial. And, picking two villages, quote unquote, at random in the African bush and giving mothers in one, $10 if their kids go to school and not in the other, and seeing what happens is not good enough. So there's a lot of really exciting, innovative, responsive economics and finance, and I think we're going to be able to stop talking of them as two separate disciplines, I hope. It may take a generation. There's an enormous amount of really exciting, innovative work going on, and you all are having the opportunity to participate in it. So, henceforth, this rough magic I do now abjure. I will answer questions and enter into discussion, but I'm through being a talking head. And why don't we take a break? And we've got another hour or so. If we meet, connect back up about 10:35, we'll have a short hour for conversation and discussion.
May I just ask you one question right now?
You may.
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
I may or may not answer it.
Let's see. So I would like to get back to the initial statement you gave in your talk, where you basically said that right now the digital revolution is no more dependent on any kind of state intervention, right?
No, state support and sponsorship.
All right.
It's
okay.
challenging the state.
Mm-hmm.
That's the inversion
Okay.
between the relationship between.
So I would have two questions towards the statement, because first of all, and I would like to hear your perspective as a professor in venture capitalist as well, how the state should shape the actual developments that you just described to us, and also furthermore how this role should expand, because how society could held a share in this development going on. So probably everyone in this room read the book of Matsukato, where she referred herself to the role of the state before the beginning of this revolution, where the state takes its role of investing, kind of similar to venture capital.
Yeah, I know Mariana's work extremely well. I know Mariana very well, and it's terrific work. I do think it would have benefited from an acknowledgement that rent-seeking behavior between the state and entrepreneurs is persistent all the time, and indeed infected a good deal of what she celebrates. First, it's too late for that now, right? Maybe the American state should have gotten a golden share in Intel. Yeah, that was then. That was 50 years ago. Not going to happen now. But there is a subject that's worth picking up on from that. I said that the digital revolution, not innovation as a whole, the digital revolution is no longer dependent on state support and sponsorship. But what about the next one? What about the next technologically driven transformation of economic, social, political life? The Green Revolution. In short, US has abdicated. We don't want to know about it. Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Agriculture in the Trump administration have banned the use of the term climate change. I'm not making that up. They've told scholars applying for research funding, resubmit without the words climate change. In retrospect, if the administration, the current administration, lasts through a full term, I think its most persistently significant contribution will have been to accelerate the rise to global leadership, with particular respect to the Green Revolution of China, where state sponsorship of the Green Revolution at both the micro level and the more macro level regulatorily is obviously evolving pretty rapidly. That's where state sponsorship, whether it's through carbon tax, specific regulatory interventions, subsidies for renewable energy, that's where dependence of technological innovation still requires state sponsorship, even if it requires less and less and less. I noted that in the annual auction over how much the wind power companies of Britain need in subsidy, or the minimum price they need to get from the government, came down by 47% this year versus last year, because despite the decline in conventional fossil fuel prices, because of the increased efficiency of wind power. Questions later. Okay. Questions, discussion. Who wants to argue? Nikolaj, I expected no less.
I had a question on the states. We assume, based on the last technological revolution, that the state is the one providing the ultimate institutional solutions to the new problems created by the new companies. But the last time the state was, in terms of geographical scale, more powerful or equally powerful to the new large companies of the day, because most of those companies were in fact entrapped on national markets. And so you could bargain between almost equals between Henry Ford and the President of the US and so on. And so on. This time, the new companies have grown up to a much larger scale, to a global scale.
But you know, this is a very good point about the relationship, the scale and reach of private corporations versus the state. We have a long history of very large international corporations challenging, escaping from state oversight. The first one that I have any knowledge of course, is the British East India Company, which by the early 19th century was exercising all the attributes of what Acemoglu and Robinson would refer to as an extractive state institution across India. Now, in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, the East India Company was challenged by members of the British political establishment, particularly Edmund Burke. Its Governor General, or whatever the hell he was called, Warren Hastings, was impeached, summoned back, tried in Parliament. The East India Company survived. And however, through the first half of the 19th century, it was subject to repeated political assault until the Great Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 destroyed its legitimacy because it proved incompetent at what it claimed to be its rightful position and role in the world, and was in effect nationalized. Now, the state that nationalized the East India Company was very small. It was tiny. 50 years later, 1907, again, the giant companies, not just the industrial trusts and the railway companies, were very much substantially larger in terms of total employees, in terms, in many cases, of actual revenues. The United States government was tiny. It was minuscule. I don't have the numbers. I don't know how good they would be around circa 1900. In 1929, the federal government accounted for 2% of GDP in the United States, 2%. But in 1900, between roughly 1900 and the First World War, in response to the enormous increase in concentrated power in the private sector, the progressive movement, which was bipartisan, it was Teddy Roosevelt, his successor, whom he despised, but who was actually a stronger antitrust enforcer than he was, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, presided as presidents over a succession of legislative initiatives, which included, indeed, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which substantially increased the antitrust powers of the federal government. While, as I mentioned, the industrial trusts were very large, the one that was considered to be the most dangerous was called the money trust, and was identified with J.P. Morgan, with the House of Morgan, which was very much an international institution, and which served as, for example, the financial agent for the British government through World War I, presided over the liquidation of 300 years of accumulated wealth in order to fight World War I, thereby enabling the U.S. to succeed to financial hegemony in the 1920s. It didn't know how to exercise it in any responsible way, which was part of the catastrophe of the interwar years. But we've certainly seen very large, disproportionately large private institutions challenge the state. Now, today we live in what Hyminski refers to as a regime of big government capitalism rather than the small government capitalism that preceded World War I, preceded the Great Depression. Even in the United States, the federal government is 20% and the states are another approximately 15% of total, so the public sector is order of magnitude 35%. And that's the smallest of OECD countries in terms of share of national income. When you add in the transfer payments of Social Security and social benefits, which of course should be added in because, as in 2009, they maintain continuity in the level of effective demand under conditions of financial and economic crisis. I find it unlikely that the relatively very small European Commission will fail to enforce its fine against Google. 2.4 billion euros is not a trivial sum, even for Google. The GPRD, did I get the initials right? Or is it GRPD? It's the privacy initiative in Europe. All American companies are going to be subject to it and are scrambling to work out what the hell it means. The continuing both retail and local state, that is state versus federal, attacks on Facebook, the insistence that these new digital service companies with their enormous reach accept public, quasi-public responsibilities, I think that's unstoppable. The U.S., Americans like to speak of, there's a long history of American exceptionalism, which is usually conceived of and propagated as an unmitigated good. You know, we're the place where the good people escaped from Europe, from horrible old Europe with its aristocratic class system, and the Puritans established. The Puritans are our American Taliban. Don't worry, I'm half descended from a Mayflower ancestor. The Puritans proclaimed that they were establishing a city on the hill that would be a beacon of light to a sin and sinful world. American exceptionalism, turns out, is very largely about the distinctive role of race in the culture, politics, economics of the country, which overlaps with and in some ways concealed the persistence of class as a source of social divisiveness and social dynamism. I said I'd given you the last book for your reading list. There's another book, which I'm delighted to say is a second edition, by the same author, Gary Gersel, the Paul Mellon Professor of American History at Cambridge, the author of Liberty and Coercion. He has another book, first published 10 years ago, called American Crucible, on the relationship of American civic inclusive nationalism. Everyone who gets off the boat is an American. All men are created equal with inalienable rights. And racial nationalism. Never forget, this is a white man's country. And the intricate, conflicting, contested dance between the two. And the new chapter he added for the second edition on what he calls the era of Obama begins with the horrible irony that the election of the first black president in American history triggered a revival of racial nationalism, the consequences of which have interacted with the universal consequences of digitalization and globalization to make it possible for Donald Trump to hijack the Republican Party, which had exposed itself to being hijacked by its alignment with the resurgence of racial nationalism. Those are issues which obviously have global significance because of the hegemonic role that America has played over the last 70 years. But they are distinctively American. And right now, they are certainly crippling any national political response to the consequences of the digital revolution in the United States. Another reason why, as I say, I see America willfully abdicating leadership, both with respect to the consequences of the digital revolution, which we're now roughly halfway through, maybe a little more, and with respect to the next green revolution. There's always another book. This is only metaphorical in its relevance, but there was a great work of the 1930s by a British writer named George Dangerfield called The Strange Death of Liberal England, and how somewhere between 1900 and 1914, Britain, the unquestioned economic, financial, political leader nation, with this evolved form of liberal, small L liberal, representative democracy became so tied up in its internal conflicts that it found escape from internal paralysis and conflict into the Great War. But between the Ulster Rebellion, the threat of trade union direct activism, the first imposition, the direct assault on the political and economic and financial power of the aristocracy by Lord George, and not least, the fight for votes for women. Britain became so tied up in its own internal conflicts that it too, in its own way, was pursuing a path that would have led it to abdicate leadership, not just lose it. So there's a metaphor there as well. But, so I don't think that Facebook escapes from political state counter-movement any more than I expect Alibaba will. And I mean, it's going to be, there's a different book by a different author, because I know nowhere near enough to write about how the three-player game, as I call it, evolves in China. But we can certainly see some of its dynamics taking place as Xi Jinping moves to address the excessive, what I call the corruption tax associated with state-sponsored economic development, and which I wish Mariana had talked more about in her book. It would have enhanced its credibility. And the explosion of economic and financial wealth in China. I'm going from here to Switzerland, and I brought a suit along with me because I'll be giving a talk, giving a keynote at the Swiss Economic, what did they call it? The Swiss Economic and Climate Summit in Bern. And I'm going to talk about leaders and followers in the innovation economy, where we have this, remarkable historical fact that we've only really seen one clear succession from Britain to the United States in unequivocal leadership. Germany was poised in roughly 1900, 1910, to take over leadership as the first nation of the science-based industries, certainly the world leader in chemistry, and at least co-equal with the United States in electricity, the only place in the world where you could get a PhD, the founder of research-based universities and serious scientific education, and then had the worst 30 years of any nation since the Treaty of Westphalia. But today we're looking at, you will live to as witnesses and perhaps participants in the second great transfer of leadership. I'm too old to learn Mandarin. I just sent Carlotta a note saying that we're both too old to learn Mandarin, but you're not. And it may become a useful, perhaps even necessary instrument going forward. That's a long answer to a short question, Nicola. Yes?
I have a question about the becoming green revolution that you talked about, clean technologies and venture capital. Because I read an article earlier this year in the MIT Technology Review called Why Bad Things Happen to Clean Technology Startups. And this was about, you might be familiar with it, Aquion Energy, which was a battery company that did everything right, but still, and they had a lot of finance, but still they couldn't make it profitable because I'm guessing there's no state support of the long...
They're two different, this is about the role of venture capital in clean tech, green tech. There's some good literature. I don't have it on this. Some very good literature on the fiasco. The venture capital, US venture capital attempted to promote a clean tech bubble back just before the global financial crisis. And you can see the data, you can see the big increase in venture funding and then the tail off. And there's been a good analysis. If you send me an email, and I'm pretty accessible, I can send you a reference on this. Or I can send it to your organizers who can distribute it. Several factors. One, on the economic side, by and large, green tech, clean tech has, let me back up. Here's one reference. William Bonvillian, Bonvillian, longtime representative of MIT in Washington, produced a paper comparing the DARPA and ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, that was created under the Obama administration. The first thing is, of course, ARPA-E's budget at best was a tenth of DARPA's budget. But as they pointed out, this is sort of the setting institutional frame. In the case of DARPA, there was essentially no incumbent industry. There were two giant corporations in the old, if you like, analog data processing and communications world, AT&T and IBM, and they both wanted to get on the digital bandwagon, whereas the conventional fossil fuel-based energy industry is actually probably the largest industry in the world, with trillions of dollars of embedded assets. And in a book, keep coming up with books, Bonvillian is co-author of a book called, it's got one of those really spellbinding titles, Technological Innovation in Legacy Industries. It's excellent. And energy is one of the subjects of how hard it is to bring innovation from the outside into a sector where the incumbents not only have enormous economic presence, but their economic presence is embedded in a matrix of regulatory subsidy and support state structures that have to do with tax, that have to do with R&D, with treatment of depreciation, all that sort of thing. And so that is a very, very good scene setting. Now, in the paper, DARPA versus ARPA-E, Bonvillian goes on to discuss how DARPA had these big brothers called the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And as they nurtured genuinely innovative science at the frontier, those big brothers could become collaborators as lead customers, creative, collaborative customers who would pay uneconomic prices and pull the vendors down the learning curve to low-cost, commercially relevant production. So in the digital world, you have this break point in 1980. It's very clear. It's when the PC revolution, as it was called, the commercial markets for microprocessors leapt ahead, outstripped the military demand. And the marker was a DARPA program called Next Generation. It was the next, this is not the title, the Next Generation, VISIC. No, it was not very high speed. Yeah, it was VISIC, very high speed integrated circuits. It was to have a decimal order of magnitude increase in the processing power of microprocessors, and DARPA held a competition, and Intel refused to participate because Intel's management realized that the commercial opportunity of addressing not pure performance regardless of cost, which is what the military wanted, but optimal trade-off between price and performance, which was going to be necessary to win the IBM PC, which is what made Intel, for the 16-bit microprocessor, the standard, the industry standard, and created the basis for the Wintel duopoly with Microsoft for 25 years. It did not want its engineers working on that project. Now, going back to A123, there was no big brother. If we had been designing the federal government's sponsorship of battery technology, which is arguably the biggest missing link in the green revolution, what we would have done would have been to sponsor 10, 20 different projects on different approaches to next generation post-lithium battery technology. And as one or more of those proved themselves at the lab level, at the bench level, we would have invited the Army to put them into 10 trucks and run them around the Mojave Desert. And if they worked, we'll put them in 1,000, and then in 10,000. And we'll pay a silly price to do that, because that will what will be necessary to translate the technology into commercially relevant cost-performance terms. In fact, the Navy, which has actually usually been known as the SMART Service, it was the Office of Naval Research, by the way, that invented computer science as an academic discipline, back long before DARPA was even an idea in the 1940s. The Navy actually tried this. There's an iconic term in American history called the Great White Fleet. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, and along with his imperialist friends like Henry Cabot Lodge, wanted to project American power globally, they sent a fleet of 1901 vintage battleships around the world. It wasn't huge, it was nowhere near the strength of the Royal Navy. But they were all painted white, and the idea was a sort of show of force, showing up on the global stage as we came at the peak of colonialization. Well, about 10 years ago, the Navy proposed a great green fleet, that they were going to experiment with running naval warships on biofuels and generate demand for the variety of different approaches to converting biomass into hydrocarbon fuel, renewable energy. Congress vetoed it. Guess what? Biofuel was going to cost more than fuel oil. So that was an example of the U.S. directly turning its back. And any appeal, and this was as much about energy self-sufficiency as it was about response to climate change. But it shows the radical importance of this economically transcendent political mission to legitimize state investments at the technological frontier, where the return is not just risky, it's not just subject to some kind of stochastic distribution generated by a stationary process. It's fundamentally unknowable what the return is going to be. Through the Cold War, military, national security justified these kinds of investments, justified Project Apollo, the return on which is still unknowable. Those missions don't seem to be available to the American state today. But A123 came down as much. Oh, by the way, using loan guarantees for super high-risk frontier startups is actually a really dumb idea. I mean, who are you kidding? Right? Sir?
Yes. 2 days ago we had a session with Professor Perez, and one of the things that she claimed was that after the crisis we have in practice failed to redefine the role of government.
Yeah.
And we still live in a world where finance is
She's right.
etc. And we still live in a bubble, even maybe a bigger one in the equity markets. So I was wondering if you agree with this and whether you think, just like her, that there's underinvestment in the real economy.
I agree, but with some twists. So, first of all, 2008 was the first global financial crisis of what Minsky called big government capitalism. I already gave you the numbers. And again, just to repeat, in 1929, total US public sector is 7%, but 5 percentage points of that was state and local government. The largest single expenditure of government was on school teacher salaries. State governments in the United States are required to balance their budgets constitutionally because of all the times that states defaulted in the 19th century. There's a little lesson here for the history of the euro. So they had to reduce their spending as the revenues declined with the economic collapse from 1930-31 on. In Europe, Britain was maybe 15% public sector. Germany, before Hitler, probably about the same. It had a somewhat more developed social safety net, thanks to Bismarck. But none of them were at the level of the 35 to 50% in 2007 across the developed OECD world. Consequently, outside of Southern Europe, where Germany enforced austerity at an extreme level, unemployment peaked out around 10 to 12%. In 1933, unemployment in the United States, as measured, and it's a lousy measurement, was 25%. But that was in an economy that was 30% agricultural still. So underemployment, the migration of people away from it's not really counted in the data. So put 25% as the lower bound. In Germany, it was 30%. And again, that's a lower bound given an economy that was even more still agricultural than the US. The result was two different forms of radical political response. Fortunately, the US had not had the experience of losing World War I and hyperinflation and Versailles. So the US got lucky with Roosevelt. Germany got very unlucky indeed, as did the world. The simplest way to think about the difference between 2008 and 1933 is that 25% unemployment, where the political process has remained more or less continuous with history in the US, that gives you Glass-Steagall. That gives you radical financial reform and very large increases in income tax over time. A lousy 10 to 12% unemployment only gives you Dodd-Frank. So there are consequences to what Minsky accurately anticipated would be the manner in which the triple way that big government could buffer and insulate the real economy from a financial crisis. So the good news is the bad news. And, you know, it's not quite fair to say if you really want radical financial reform, you're kind of wishing that we'd had 25% unemployment instead of only 11% unemployment in 2009. That's unfair because nobody's really wishing that. But it's a way of thinking about the limits of radical reform. Now, another way, another absolutely critical way, this is American exceptionalism. Obama gets elected. The Republican Party dedicates itself to alignment with the resurgent racial nationalism. The majority leader of the Senate after the 2010 election says, "My only job is to prevent the president from having a second term." Now that's unprecedented in American history, or at least unprecedented since 1860, which you may know was the election before the Civil War. So the paralysis of American policy is distinctive, if not unique, in its roots in this intersection of big government capitalism buffering the economic consequences, but the election of Obama in that context triggering resurgent racial nationalism. That has to do with we didn't have enough reform in 2009-10. I agree we didn't. But that's the context, in my view, in which it's necessary to think about it and to interpret it. Now, today, this is where I differ with Carlota Perez in that the one major reform that has been operational across the developed world is a radical reduction in bank leverage from order of magnitude 30x plus to order of magnitude 10 to 15. That chart up there, that radically reduces the potential for decline in asset prices to trigger a financial crisis and consequently an economic crisis. There's no doubt that stocks and shares on exchanges are running way ahead of, quote, fundamentals. Although the fundamentals do reflect the more general concentration of economic power and the decline in labor share. Okay, some more additions to your reading list. And by the way, this fits with my thesis that we're winning. So David Autor, A-U-T-O-R, at MIT, produced a succession of extraordinary papers with his colleagues. One of the most interesting is called The Rise of the Superstar Firm and the Fall in Labor Share, or The Fall in Labor Share and the Rise of the Superstar Firm, something like that. And it shows that the increased profitability of the big digitally informed and driven companies is actually having macro consequences based on inter-firm profitability translating into much higher levels of compensation, even if it's unequal compensation within the firm. This fits with something you haven't asked about, the productivity puzzle and the OECD and Bank of England data that shows that the top order of magnitude, 10% of firms are right on track with long-term trends in productivity, but the spread from the best to the rest has increased substantially over the last generation, as if most firms are having trouble learning how to deal with data, deal with big data. The best have learned how to do it and have phenomenal productivity results. To me, it's analogous to how long it took the productivity gains from electrification to translate across manufacturing industry and distribution, when manufacturing was a much larger portion of the economy back before World War II. But the point here with respect to the potential for a new crisis, elements of discontinuity, sources of discontinuity in capital markets are obvious. As Bob Schiller wrote just the other day, the CAPE is at it's approaching an all-time high. That is the cyclically adjusted PE ratio. But most importantly, thanks to the paralysis of fiscal policy and the total reliance on monetary policy over the last decade, real interest rates at 0 to negative levels created an investment environment, which is what I was talking about, the unicorns, can be generalized. Bond prices are a function of not just very low policy rates, but unsustainably compressed credit spreads. I have no doubt that when the ECB and the Federal Reserve, and secondarily the Bank of England, start reducing their balance sheets, which they will, there will be a discontinuity in the bond market. I have no doubt about that. And that will almost certainly spill over, reinforced by recognition that the incoherent incompetence of the Trump administration is not going to deliver the tax reform that capitalists in America are rooting for, and that while they are beneficiaries of this rent-seeking attack on the, quote, administrative state through the reduction in regulatory oversight, not only in energy, but across the boards, it won't be enough to justify the expectations, the profit expectations built into current stock prices. So I think there's going to be a major correction in asset prices, financial asset prices. But given the much reduced leverage in the banking system and the clear recognition that the central banks have for the state of bank leverage as the signal and trigger for intervention, I truly doubt that the correction in the prices of financial assets will spill over to generate another financial crisis. That's a very long-winded answer to a very relevant question. So the question, do I agree with Carlota Perez? The answer is yes and no. Mary.
Yeah, I thought it was very stimulating the way you framed the discussion in very long-term historical perspective, perhaps not surprisingly. But this starting with merchants, medieval and early modern merchants, giving credit through networks based on trust, and then talking about currencies, national currencies, and lender of last resort as a way of compensating for the lack of that trust in some kind of natural way, and then on to cryptocurrencies. But when you talk about cryptocurrencies, at least if I understand them to be virtual currencies, I wondered why you didn't talk about local currencies. And I'm particularly interested in a Swiss example, which is called WIR. And WIR stands for those of you who don't know, it stands for, I think it's Wirtschaftsring Genossenschaft. So it's an economic circle cooperative. Yeah? And WIR is also supposed to connote, this is the part that's interesting to me, we in German, right? So to emphasize the community dimension. And it has, I think, 60,000 members today. It was created in the 30s. And it was inspired by a guy called Silvio Gesell, who was, he was a libertarian economist, but a socialist, right? So he was not the usual brand, at least.
Oscar Lange.
Yeah, right. It was set up by two Swiss people, two Swiss men in the 30s as a response to credit shortages during the Great Depression.
Right.
So the reason that I asked you the question is because what's interesting about it is that it's based on the means of exchange, right? So the whole thing's about promoting greater trade in the network. And convertibility is restricted, heavily restricted. So the problem that you identify, I think you're quite right, it can't be a store of value. In fact, underlying it is the notion in French, it's called monnaie fondante. So the money disappears. If you hold it, it disappears. So there's all kinds of ways they try to regulate this. But it's a kind of fascinating experiment. And in the last 5 years or so, there's been all kinds of concerns that the Swiss bankers are kind of invading it and trying to corrupt it and take it over because they hate it. But it's ultimately inspired by two things. One is the need to promote trade in times of credit shortages, and two, there's an anti-usury feature of it, which is somewhat diminished historically, but that was Gesell's whole thing. He didn't want interest. So you lent to your trade partners and you charged them nothing, because they were safe, because you trusted them. And it just seems like in many ways it responds to, before the Bitcoin emerges, it responds to many of the problems that you're identifying with Bitcoin. So I'm wondering, are you in fact a passionate advocate of local currency?
Okay. Well, first I'm going to go back to your introduction, Mary, because in talking about the history of credit and banking and currencies, I left out one little element there, which is the invention of central banks, those lenders of last resort, and why they were created in Amsterdam and London, respectively, at the end of the 17th century. And of course, they were created because the least trustworthy borrower was a sovereign. The last person a banker wanted to lend to was someone who, instead of saying, oh, I owe you some money, here it is, say, you know what, I think I'm going to cut your head off. The Rothschilds learned that the hard way. So in each case, in order to fund their wars against each other, again, the politically legitimate mission, the governments of the Netherlands and of England invented a financing institution to be able to mobilize the capital, the liquid capital of their merchant and aristocratic constituencies to be able to fight a war with each other. And the responsibilities of those two banks evolved over time. Now, coming to local currencies, I actually have seen a lovely example originating for exactly the same reason of a local currency which was created in Princeton University, my alma mater, in March of 1933, when Roosevelt declared the bank holidays, and by that time, across the country, there had been state bank holidays, and Princeton University issued scrip. It was a Princeton dollar. And it was as good as a merchant's faith in the survivability of the university through the crisis of the winter of 1932-33, which, believe me, was greater than the crisis of the winter of 2008-9. But once the banks reopened, and if you had a choice as an individual between holding Princeton paper, which you could use to buy a newspaper, maybe a bottle of milk, downtown on Nassau Street, or holding a dollar bill, which you could use to buy anything available, including from Sears Roebuck, manufactured 2,000 miles away through mail order retail, which was the functional analog equivalent of Amazon. Which would you rather have? The fact is, a local currency is local. I'd be surprised if the people who use local currencies in Switzerland don't also use Swiss francs.
They do, yeah.
Yeah, they have to.
Yeah.
So the potential, as I say, in a way, the real irony of the blockchain innovation is that the technology is being deployed, in a sense, you might say, in what are virtually local spaces. Maritime insurance, securities settlement. There's a big downtown DTC, the Depository Trust Company, which is owned by the major banks, major brokerage and banks in New York, is experimenting with blockchain technology to see if it will actually reduce the cost of settling securities transactions. In a sense, that's a local use case. It's not being used as a substitute. I mean, Amazon is not accepting Bitcoin. I'm sorry, guys. And as long as the most used currency is going to be the one that Amazon accepts. And by the way, one reason Amazon accepts it is that if we do have another 2008, it has a very high degree of confidence that the Federal Reserve is going to intervene and maintain continuity in the utility of dollars as means of exchange. So I can see a variety of geographically displaced local communities using virtual means of exchange and settlement. And that would seem to me to be the obvious opportunity. And I mean geographically displaced because it's on the net.
Financial innovators.
Right.
And then fintech, for example, right? Financial innovation in general. But the capacities or capabilities of regulators to understand the technical side of that. Is there any solid research done on that?
Well,
Can we actually study that?
You had somebody told me that, was Richard Brookstaver here?
We organized a webinar.
A webinar with Rick Berkstaver is a really, really smart guy who had the extraordinary good judgment to publish a book called A Demon of Our Own Design before the crisis, in which he accurately identified the financial innovations that were going to explode in our faces. And he actually begins the book quite amusingly by saying that he had played an active role in 3 attempts to destroy capitalism. First, in portfolio insurance in 1987 at JP Morgan, which produced the crash of '87. Second, in the long-term capital management catastrophe of 1999, because when Salomon Brothers was effectively put out of business and forced to be acquired by Citibank, he was the guy responsible for liquidating the portfolio that John Merriweather had accumulated based on playing very narrow spreads with enormous leverage, 100-to-1 leverage among financial assets, which Merriweather had taken with him to long-term capital management, which he founded with 2 Nobel Prize winners in financial economics, Bob Merton and no, it was Modigliani and Miller, with Miller from Chicago. And at Citibank, his boss was Jamie Dimon before Sandy Weil fired Jamie Dimon. And Jamie Dimon told him to liquidate the portfolio. So he liquidated a mirror portfolio of what was held by long-term capital management and claimed credit for liquidating long-term capital management, whose leverage was so huge that it threatened the financial system and induced the Federal Reserve to force the banks to bail out long-term capital management and run off its assets. By the way, special credit for anybody who knows which Wall Street bank refused to participate in bailing out long-term capital management. Anybody know? It was Bear Stearns. Who said Bear Stearns? You did. Yeah. So that was why there wasn't a dry eye in the house when Bear Stearns was the first bank to be threatened with liquidation in the run-up to the global financial crisis of 2008. They had no sympathy from anybody because they'd refused to be a team player 8 years before. And then the third, of course, was Brookstaver's role in the rise of complex exotic derivatives, CDO squared, et cetera, et cetera. So, Bookstaber, the question has to do with the ability of the regulators to catch up with the financial innovators. By the way, that begins with inside the bank. So all of these banks had big risk management departments that were supposed to keep track of what the traders were doing. The traders had faster computers, better algorithms, and smarter operators than the risk managers. So they were able to run out of control. When the British financial crisis hit, and Royal Bank of Scotland was the largest bank in Britain and one of the largest banks in the world, it happened that the chief financial officer at RBS, Guy Whitaker, had gone from Citibank to RBS just in time for the crisis. He played no role in it, but unfortunately, he actually signed the check that bought the Dutch bank, which was the bridge too far, and that radically over-leveraged RBS. The head of RBS was a deal maker called Fred Godwin, known as Fred the Shred, because he bought banks and fired everybody. And I once asked Guy whether he thought that Fred Godwin had any idea what the letters VAR meant. And he said, not in a million years. Well, value at risk was a really, really bad way of trying to track balance sheet risk in a bank. But it was the canonical method that was used before 2008. Now, having said all that, Bookstaber was one of the champions. I was part of a very large informal committee that promoted something called the Office of Financial Regulation that was established in the Treasury against the wishes of the Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, and whose mission is to keep track of what the hell is going on. It has a congressional mandate. It was included in Dodd-Frank. It has a congressional mandate to play the role that it should be. I expect that there will be a Secretary of the Treasury who empowers it to play that role. But there will always be, the potential for really smart innovators. And there's a long history here. The tulip bulbs in 1630 were, that bubble was driven in large part by the invention of futures. People didn't trade tulips, they traded future contracts on tulips. Almost every major bubble has been accompanied by and motivated the invention of new modes of financial innovation. And by and large, the regulators are reduced to kind of finding out what went wrong and trying to stop it from happening again. By the way, I do not think that breaking up investment banks and commercial banks would be much of a contribution today. I think hard regulation of banking leverage and liquidity, regardless of what you're doing with your assets, is a much more effective technique. And there's another question about employee compensation, but by and large, as banks become less profitable, they will reward their executives less well. But I do think there will always be this catch-up game. And what matters is when really smart people do really stupid things, what are the systemic consequences? And the way to limit that is limiting the leverage of the banking system. So it's 11:30, Jay.
Yeah, I have a very a personal question to end. Maybe it's too personal, who knows. But if you were a grad student in our position and you were taking up sort of a new life's project for within this context of building a new intellectual tradition, you already mentioned, alluded to a couple. What would you take on? That's the first question. Second question, if we were like to have a similar sort of aesthetic style in dressing, where do we go shopping for a bow tie?
Oh, that's easy. Seiko, 90th Street and Madison Avenue in New York, has the best ties in the world, both regular ties and bow ties. They have, I think, another shop in the 60s. SEIKO, it's a Japanese entrepreneurial retailer who makes his own designs and makes his own ties. They're fabulous.
When did you start buying bow ties? When did that happen?
Well, I've been bought bow ties for many, many, many years, but I only really started wearing them regularly after I retired from vice chairmanship at Warburg Pincus and returned to academia. That was about 10 years ago. But on the first question, well, I do think the action at the micro, meso, and macro level, the action is reconstructing a single discipline, whether we call it financial economics or economics and finance or what have you. And looking at, and by the way, one thing I didn't mention, but this goes with why I feel good about where the discipline is and where it's going, is the statistically verifiable shift towards empirical versus theoretical work. There's just a paper published in the AER that looked at across all the subdisciplines. It's quite general. So I'd be looking at the kind of work. I'll give you a couple of examples. We've had a couple of different postdocs in Cambridge working on things like consequences for corporate R&D spending as a consequence of exposure to the financial crisis. So looking at who their creditors were and differentially, empirically examining who cut R&D more. There's one example. Clearly, there's been a huge amount of work, largely, I mean, the OTOR's group as a whole has done a ton of work on the impact on inequality of the skills-based sources, but there's more work to be done than I've seen, it seems to me, on the relationship between financialization and inequality. Looking at the role of capital gains and stock options, particularly as you move up to the 1% and above, and understanding what we can see is the fractal nature of the increase in inequality. You see it, within the 1%, within the 0.1%, within the 0.001%. Well, what's going on there? How much of that is Jensen's fault? How much of that is taking what we used to call Silicon Valley socialism and giving stock options to people whose the left-hand side of whose balance sheets were guaranteed by taxpayers? I think there's some more work to be done there. But in general, I think it's the intersection of the financial system and the real economy where a lot of the action is. And so that's a short answer to, I mean, there are many other areas of real interest going on, but yes, one.
Yeah, what are your arguments against a Glass-Steagall Act?
Against, you mean against a new Glass-Steagall? First of all,
Or just the 1933 one?
Oh, I think that at the time it was probably a worthwhile exercise. I think it was. But the old Wall Street was so segmented and so disintegrated. I think here, today where we are, you basically got 9 banks that dominate all world markets. Well, that's a small number. You can really treat them almost as public utilities. Tell them how much debt they're allowed to carry. And I think that there was a lot of appeal. I mean, it was actually, ironically, it was the University of Chicago was the source of the most radical proposed reform, the narrow banking proposal in the 1930s, that banks that took deposits could only invest in government securities, right? But I don't think I just don't think it's terribly relevant today. The attempt, I mean, I was sympathetic to the Volcker rule, but you know, when we have this discontinuity in the bond market, we're going to see the downside of that. Because if banks can't trade for their own account, that means there's going to be very little liquidity in the bond market when institutions start selling bonds. And they will start selling bonds when the Federal Reserve starts selling bonds. So I think that there's a lot to be said. In America, there's a kind of dual progressive tradition. One was the Brandeisian, small L liberal, break them up, break them up, break them up, have lots of little things playing around, versus the kind of Teddy Roosevelt progressive, which is let them get big, but then regulate the hell out of them. If we tried to deal with electrification without any kind of consolidation, it would have been really hard to, and we've had a mess. I'll tell you what looks like a real mess is the insurance industry. Highly diversified, highly fragmented, and subject to regulation at the state, not federal level. So I'm not against bigness per se. I'm against bigness counterbalanced by appropriate regulation.
Just another question on this, because you said that you believe more in the strict regulation of balance sheet expansion on part of the bank. But right now, you also mentioned the fact that this lack of elasticity brings the risk of severe discontinuities in the market because there is less balance sheet space to accommodate that. So what is your final take on that? Because right now we do have strict regulation. Now balance sheets, bank balance sheet is expensive and leverage is much reduced, as you correctly point out. So the point is, what do we need to accept this strong trade-off? So this is still a good regime because it avoids the bad bubbles, although it comes at the price of severe discontinuities in the market, or there is some other institutions and some other regulations that need to come on top of this?
I'm pretty comfortable with the notion that stock prices will go up and down, and that nobody really can know, whether or not the stock price is ultimately going to be validated by what happens, what the returns are that are
but it's also bond markets, right? We're talking about severe risk.
I understand. But the bond market, again, it depends on how leveraged it is. And if, I'm actually much more in favor of having active margin requirements for tradable securities, tradable financial assets generally, because leverage is both the enabler and the threat. And so I don't disagree with you, but I don't think that, there was this movement after 1929 and there are states in the United States where the state secretary of state has to approve the price at which shares are sold, that they will be fair. The Chinese tried this for a while. That's not a very effective way of regulating. So the point is you want people to be able to go bust, but with limited negative externalities. Bankruptcy is the market's way of telling you to slow down, just as death is life's way. On that happy note, I think we're done.